Hi and welcome back to the Nook. Welcome back to a wrap-up video. Today is the February wrap-up video and I have more books this month than last month. So I read a total of how many books here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 5-ish books because I'm currently still reading one of these books. So I read 6 books in total and I'm currently reading 2 books right now. And I'm just gonna go straight into it. At the end of the video, I will also be sharing some of the content that I've been consuming that have really shaped my February. The very first book I want to talk about is Post-Growth Living for an Alternative Hedonism by Soper. I don't know whether I've really talked about this book in depth, but this is definitely an ideas book rather than really like a book that you pour over every single detail. Because of the ideas, I really enjoyed the book. I wouldn't say that the writing was fantastic, nor was the entire argument something that I feel was very, very compelling, but I do think the ideas in and of themselves are extremely relevant and something very worth thinking about in greater depth, I think, nowadays, especially with a lot of talks about, how do we build a more sustainable and ethical society. This is definitely more on the theoretical and much more for affluent, privileged societies, but I do think that that's still worth reading. The more affluent you are, like the more privileged you are, it's harder to really like be very critical of yourself in a way that is still very constructive. And I think this was a pretty good read, especially for someone that struggles with like, how do we talk to a system where everyone in the system seems to truly believe that they're benefiting from the system. I think it's really different when you want to talk to people who have been taught and who believe their whole lives that the system benefits them when actually it doesn't really benefit them. And it's a lot clearer to talk about those that have already been marginalized by society and to like fight for social change from that perspective. But the reality is that in order to really reconstruct the society, we really need like everyone to take a critical stance towards it, and that includes people who have already benefited from such systems. I can see why people might not enjoy this book because the writing can get quite clunky at the start. I think I only really got into the book in the second half where I felt like the ideas were a lot more approachable, whereas the first half was very deep into the theoretical history, background, context, and had a lot of that theory wrangling moments, which I felt like may be relevant to setting up the ideas at the back, but for someone who's a bit more of a general reader, that can be very off-putting. But if you're someone that wants very, very in-depth, like detailed theory wrangling, then you might enjoy the first few chapters a lot more. But for me, I feel like this is a book that is very full of references that I will go back to when I need to draw on some like theory. Whether I would recommend it, I would for people who are, in similar situations I mentioned above, people in affluent societies that struggle with talking to people in privilege. I think this would be an interesting book to pick up for that. Okay, the next book I read was How to Save Our Planet, The Facts by Maslin. Well, this is not really a book. It's kind of like a fact sheet, so it's not really something I would consider to be a full read. I think I read it in a day, and I know some people reviewed it as like really bad because it didn't tell you much, but that's exactly what this book is for. It's really for people who never really touched anything about the climate. Like there's really so many people in the world who have not read anything environmental, anything about the climate. Yeah, shocking, I know, but it's really true that a lot of people don't. And I think this is a book that you would pass to someone at a dinner party. You have like 2 hours, right? And then you could ask this person to read this in like 30 minutes and then have the rest 1.5 an hour to discuss about what they read in this book. I think it's very interesting to ask people like what line or which part of the book was the most surprising to them or was something that they wanted to know more about, because I think this is a book that's a bit more like a conversation starter rather than anything substantial. Obviously, you read it, as for me, I've read so many different kinds of books on various topics, so the facts itself weren't very shocking to me. It wasn't something that I felt like, oh, I've never heard of this before. I like how the author went from like the very, very beginnings of the earth, like literally the chemical processes that made the earth, and then afterwards talking about the different extinctions, great extinctions, and then talking about the human civilization phase, and then finally the last few pages on possible solutions and how things could really work out if we actually enact these solutions. That was a pretty amazing feat to accomplish for such a small book. It's really small, it's very fast to read. If you're talking to already a converted crowd, it won't do much, obviously. Or if you're talking to someone that is looking for, detail, looking for research, then obviously they're not going to enjoy this book. So that is what I think I would recommend this book for. Very, very general. It's all generalizations. So take note of that. The next book I read is Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of the World by Daniel Sherrell. Now this is a memoir. I think it will actually enter one of my top books for this year. I know it's only February. I just felt like I was existing on a different time scale when I was reading this book, and rightly so, because the author does talk a lot about our concepts of time. Like, why is it so hard for us to envision time? Is it because of this theory that, I think Timothy Morton talks about, like this hyper object where something can be so large in scale that we can't even envision or imagine the scale of that, and therefore we act as though it does not exist. Things are so out of scale that we just can't possibly imagine it within our lifetime. Sherrell really did a very, very good job of weaving in together like his very vulnerable moments with all these thinkers and all these theories he's been grappling with in his own journey as an activist. I really thought that was so useful, because oftentimes memoirs can be very emotional and vulnerable, and that's very, very helpful in kind of making a connection with the topic and the reader. But at the same time, like, he introduces all these things that help us make sense a little bit more about why is it so hard for us to do anything about the climate crisis, or why is it so hard to really convey this feeling of coming out of age at a time of total collapse or something. It feels like that, and I think it was so validating to have this kind of dread being written out. But it's a book about that dread, but also about grief and hope. And the hope part was really what got to me, that this book was ultimately a hopeful one, because he's writing this letter to his potential future child, because he doesn't actually have a child, but because he's talking to a hypothetical future. He does such a great job of diving into all these literary techniques and using literature as his strength, this very beautiful narrative voice, in bridging the gap between our understanding as humans and the kind of climate crisis at hand. And I talked about this in the previous vlog, but he doesn't actually refer to anything about the climate crisis as like climate or environment. He refers to the whole thing as the problem, and I absolutely love that approach. I love how it made the problem so much more real and bigger, because it's how it feels, and not just because it's the climate or the environment, but because people tend to perceive the environment as external to us. But framing things as the problem makes it so much more real and so much closer to where we are right now. And I really like how validating this whole entire memoir was for me. But obviously the author is talking from a very well-educated English activist kind of mentality, so obviously it doesn't really talk about the frontline trauma, doesn't really talk about the direct impact of environmental change on your physical body and on your families. But he really talks about the psychological ways, the psychological existence that he's in currently, in the face of all of this. So I thought that was really, really great as a book, and the way it was written was just so beautiful. The next book I read was The Hunter by Nabeel Ismeer. I talked about this in my novels, the obscure novels, so I won't talk too much about this here, but it's a YA novel. It's very interesting concept of having it being set in the prehistoric times, and it deals with issues of colorism, racism, tribalism and all that in the face of resource scarcity. And it's kind of the very classic adventure protagonist style kind of story which I don't really read. It was really difficult for me to get into the novel at the start, but I think subsequently I started to really enjoy it as kind of a moment of escape. What I really enjoyed is that like at the end there's a lot of thought and ideas about leadership, and I also wonder why that gets lost in adult novels. We should also kind of try to find adults to emulate after, like as adults. I think it's kind of weird that we leave it behind in these adventure style novels, you know. Like, can you think of a contemporary novel where like the protagonist is, you know, this very brave and very inspirational, very aspirational person, this person that's just so persistently optimistic? Like, I feel like we need that kind of protagonist in adult novels, you know. Okay, the next novel here, again, I talked about it in my obscure novels to recommend, and this is The Weight of Our Sky by Hannah Alkaf. I really enjoyed this novel. It's a historical fiction, but it's also YA. It is a story of bravery and a story of hope, and I like how the two novels I read, the YA novels, were all about hope, and I feel like I really needed that this month because I really don't have hope. Like, I'm really bad at cultivating hope in myself. I felt like the characterization was just enough for each of the characters before you had to go on with the rest of the story. You know, it really reminded me of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which I mentioned in the video. And I feel like this is something that would be really great for a lot of younger readers, to see a representation of OCD in a novel. So I think that was great as well. In addition to the two YA novels that I completed, I also finished reading this book called Erotic Stories for Punjabi Women by Balli, Kaur, Jaswal. And this is a novel that I've had my eyes on for a while because it's a singlet, so it's by an author that's based in Singapore. And a lot of people have sung a lot of praises about this author's writing. I'm so happy that I decided to pick this book up because it was such a fantastic read. It's been a while since I enjoyed a novel so thoroughly. I think the last time I enjoyed a novel was Eka Kunyawan's, or maybe Kim Robin Stanley's book. In all of its aspects, I think it was a pretty good, compact novel that tackled a lot of complex topics. I did talk about this book again in my obscure novels, so if you realize, I spent a good amount of this whole month reading the novels I wanted to recommend in that video because I wanted to be sure that it was something that I really enjoyed before I recommended it to you all. But of course, all these books have been on my TBR for like a really long time, so I'm glad that this pushed me to finish all of them. So yes, this book, I really recommend it so much because it really captures that diasporic experience that I feel like a lot of novels don't really talk about. A lot of novels talk a lot about the assimilation of the diaspora into the kind of majority culture, but in this case, I felt like there was such a great embrace of one's own culture, but also talking about how like these kind of stereotypes that we have about different cultures hold us back from really understanding the people within these cultures as people themselves. And I think the strength in this novel is really the characters. They were fleshed out really very strongly and very powerfully in a way that you can't help but root for the different characters throughout the novel and not just the protagonist. We are following the group of widows writing kind of very racy stories, and I think that in itself is a premise really interesting and so heartwarming and really quite like freeing in a way. Like, this is really about the autonomy of a woman, the freedom of expression that these women were exercising. And I think that in itself is really truly the essence of female solidarity and feminism in a way that was really told in such an everyday context and really shown to be relevant even in places that we deem are conservative or traditional. And I love how that was a message kept to the very end. So, you know, ideas about feminism and emancipation doesn't have to look like one model or one type. Be warned though, there are actual erotic stories inside the novel, so be careful. Like, if you're not someone that's comfortable with reading those kinds of things, then take care. Like, maybe don't read it in public or something. But I think it's pretty mild. To some people it might not be mild, but they're definitely erotic, so take note of that. The last book that I finished was Lurking: How a Person Became a User by Joanne McNeil. Now, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this book because I enjoyed like a few chapters, but some other chapters just felt like the author was ranting, and I don't think ranting is wrong, but the tone was really inconsistent in some ways. Some essays were really told in a very journalistic, objective way, but other essays seemed to be those kind of personal commentaries that you would see in someone's newsletter. I really felt like that, especially the chapter on Facebook that the author wrote towards the end. I really enjoyed the first few chapters where she talked about like the early history of the internet and how she herself kind of was part of that space, like, you know, i.e. MySpace. Have you heard of that? I haven't heard of that word in so long. And she talked about little different digital spaces different platforms have created over the years. So one chapter could be about the iPhone revolution, and another chapter could be on like Instagram and something like that. That was a good way of approaching the things at the start. I mean, she had a whole chapter on cam girls, or like the phenomenon of broadcasting yourself online, and that was really interesting. I felt that that was such a interesting chapter that I haven't really thought about before. I feel like this book would be interesting for like a brief history of the internet, but it wasn't really like a history book. It was really like the author's own take on what was groundbreaking in her opinion on the internet, but it wasn't really defining the internet. But maybe that's because it's so hard to draw the parameters of the digital space. And I felt like everything was just very observational. There was this one chapter on online harassment that really got to me, and after reading that chapter, I feel like I fell into a slump of like not wanting to be online at all. And I've had this phase several times in my life of not wanting to appear online at all, because I just felt such a huge rift with who I was in real life and who I was online, and also the dangers that came with doing stuff online, where, you know, growing up, people have always told me as a girl, like, don't put your face on the internet, people will come after you. I grew up with these kind of mentalities. I grew up with the idea that as a woman, I am inherently vulnerable on the internet, where I have no control over my image, and that kind of came back to me as a feeling after I read this book, which I think is not really the author's fault, but rather because she didn't really put a disclaimer that she would talk about certain issues of sexual harassment online or cyberbullying. I feel like it would have been a little bit helpful to put a little disclaimer so that I would have engaged with the chapter when I felt like I was ready to do that, because I'm sure a lot of women have experienced some kind of harassment online. I know this is not uncommon because the internet does enable a lot of people, even if they know you in real life, to really like go at you online. So I feel like that was a bit unexpected when I was reading this book. And so because of that, I felt like I had a bit more of a negative experience with this book towards the end. But I felt like the first half was still pretty commendable in a way that it did talk about a lot of the early histories that I felt that maybe younger people might be interested in knowing today. Overall, it didn't really quite get at a more overarching view of the internet or how a person became a user. It didn't really answer that question. I feel like it was just a lot of case studies and a lot of interesting insights. Because of that, I feel like maybe I would benefit a lot more from a theoretical reading of the internet. And as the author herself admitted that we are still lacking in a lot of the vocabulary to describe the digital space, and I understand that. So maybe that's why I felt like the book wasn't really working for me in that way. I would go and search out other more theoretical books that maybe might help me understand some of the terms to describe this uncanny feeling of being online. But so far, would I would recommend this book? I would only recommend it if you are okay with reading the topics that this book covers, and also if you just have some free time to think about the internet. This is a bit more casual. It isn't anything that's rigorous thinking about the internet. Very much like Trick Mirror. I don't know, I just feel like Trick Mirror is such a prime example of this like very contemporary, slightly critical, trying to be personal take on a lot of like contemporary issues today. So I feel like the writing is very similar to that. Now, talking about the books that I'm currently reading, I am reading this book, and it's a really hefty book. It's Amitav Ghosh's book, the latest non-fiction book, called The Nutmeg's Curse: Parables for a Planet in Crisis. And as expected, I'm really enjoying this book. It is tracing the origins of the nutmeg all the way to the Banda Islands, and it really traces like the roots in some way of this imperialistic conquest of the world, driven by the world's first ever capitalistic business. And I kind of feel like I'm enjoying this book a little bit more than The Great Derangement, because it is something that's a lot more tangible. Like, you're actually following a story or following a very linear kind of historical inquiry. That coupled with Ghosh's really great takes on the whole thing, which I feel like his writing is just so phenomenal in nonfiction, and he's very, very, very clear with when he's inserting his personal voice. And really good nonfiction writers are very, very precise with how they insert their own personal voice. I have very high hopes about this book, as in once I finish it, and hopefully I can incorporate this into a book club or something like that, because I feel like this is something that is worthy of discussion, especially within audiences that might not have ever thought about origins of colonialism or imperialism. And I'm going to link down below a link to an artist in Singapore that has done kind of a video performance on this topic of the nutmeg, and I thought that was such a powerful performance. The images were great and the script was so powerful as well, so do check it out if you have the time. I think that really sparked my interest in this nutmeg, and because I actually do use it in my cooking, since my family does cook a lot of Indonesian food, and nutmeg is something that is featured quite a lot in Indonesian cooking. I thought it was really interesting that I could have this kind of background story to a spice that I use pretty often, and also to trace its colonial past. And I find that that's a great way to start to explain to people what we mean by decolonizing the way that we think about our trade and the way that we treat different countries, and how we tend to forget the fact that these things have kind of originated from a history of violence. Now, I am also currently reading this book called Anthro-Vision, I think A New Way to See Business and Life by Gillian, Tett. I talked about this book in my January wrap-up as something that I was currently reading and wasn't sure whether I would continue reading. I still have the same thoughts towards this book. It's a book that's really low on my reading list, so every time I finish the other books and I have some time, I would read it on my ebook reader on my phone in between breaks and whatsoever. I find this book not bad at all, surprisingly. It isn't high on my priority list because it is something quite niche. I mean, it talks about business and it talks about the corporate world, but it does talk about anthropology, and I think that's what I've been enjoying so much about it, the way that the author kind of very deftly inserts the discipline of anthropology into modern world context, and how she draws parallels between her field work and how she's been reporting from finance and business, and how she sees the culture of this very elitist gatekeeping community in terms of economics and business and all that, and banks, whatever. And I thought that was great because I see that. I think even in my experience studying anthropology in school, we apply anthropology to very modern things. Like, we're not going out there like seeking some exotic tribe to study, because I feel like nowadays the discipline is a lot more preoccupied with the researcher being somewhat part of that culture as well. So I felt that this was a great book to introduce to people like the central tenets of anthropological study. People can actually see in practice what anthropological study could look like, which is cultural studies, kind of cross-cultural references, and all these practices of maybe field work, thick description and all that being used in a modern context, whereas traditionally the discipline has always been seen as something quite outdated, and people would rather look to sociology or they'll look to international relations or things like that. Because of this book, I feel like I might go back into more anthropology focused books again. Finally, we can move on to the content that I've been consuming this month. And I think that sounds really strange, like the content I've been consuming, but these are some of the videos and random things that I've been looking at. I think that maybe that's a better way to put it. First video I want to share is Don't Look Up, a problematic metaphor for climate change by Like Stories of Old, and all these links will be down in my description box. I recommended a video by this channel before talking about climate change, and in this case the YouTuber, the content creator, the video maker is talking quite specifically about the movie Don't Look Up, and talking about how the metaphor of a comet didn't really quite capture, or like the caveats of using this comet metaphor in really relaying the message of the climate crisis and of cooperation and things like that. What I felt was really great about this video was that it was a very thorough analysis of the metaphor, and it offered a lot of alternative frameworks and a lot of other ways of thinking about the movie. Commentary tends to be just very critical and doesn't really give you other ways to have done the thing previously, but I think this was great in a way that the comment section was also very, very engaged and very involved in discussing the different ways the movie was useful or not. And I thought that was so great because I had a lot of mixed feelings after watching the movie. Check out this video essay because I think it was a great nuanced take on the movie, and the discussion in the comments was just great to read through and to really reflect on and to really dwell on. So the next video I want to recommend is how to make potatoes while dread presses in from every direction by the Vlogbrothers. Now, watching the Vlogbrothers has been kind of like my guilty pleasure because they've been on the internet like forever, and I feel that they have mastered this kind of ease in front of the camera and ease in front of the audiences, communicates such a great sense of comfort as a viewer, even if I'm not really a fan, like a long time fan. This video was great in that it captured the mundane, but it also captured the existential anxieties that come with living in today's world. And I thought it was excellent that I think John Green really put together this video in a way that the cooking tutorial, something that was life nourishing, so simple and effective, but also acknowledging the complex emotions that we all feel as humans in today's world. And I thought that was such a great combination. Watching this video just gave me such immense levels of comfort and validation that I didn't think I needed at that point. I also really kind of want to bring that vibe into my videos as well, having these kind of everyday actions, life-affirming actions, nourishing activities that show that it's possible to keep on living even as things get really bad, and that we should still acknowledge when things get really bad. And the last video I want to recommend a Korean TV, like variety TV show, and it's on YouTube. This series is called Hyun, the Sports Master, and it's on channel Full Moon, which is produced by Nabeel, the guy that produced a lot of Korea's top variety hits. And in this series, the actor Hyun is taking on different sports and trying to master them. This is because he's kind of like a sports newbie, and every single episode was just so fun and so encouraging because all the instructors were really, really encouraging, and Hyun himself was just so earnest, and I think that gave me a lot of joy to watch, because to see someone being so earnest and to see an entire environment, an entire video where people were just encouraging each other so much to really master this basic technique, it really made me feel like there's still joy to be found in like small things, like being able to pass the ball into the net or to be able to play table tennis. And I haven't felt that in a long while because I haven't really been dancing as much, or I haven't really been going out there and using my body as much, so I kind of forgot how it was like to feel such unbridled joy when it comes to just scoring a goal or feeling in tune with the music. And this series kind of reminded me of that. It was kind of like my happy pill throughout the month, and I hope you will enjoy this series as well because it was extremely entertaining and I loved it so much. I've rewatched the videos so many times, and each one has just been such a great kind of soothing experience for me. I still have one more recommendation, and that's a website called Feral Atlas. And this is a digital project by a bunch of anthropologists that came together to discuss the way that ecological ways of thought can be kind of translated online. And I love how this website turned out because it really kind of tried to mimic how ecologies work in real life. And this is something I feel like hasn't really been explored, the idea of translating complex ecological webs onto the website, onto the internet, which is also similarly really complex and really hard to understand. The internet as this very complex ecosystem that I think kind of mimics nature in a way where things are a lot more fluid and there are just a lot more connections that we just don't see. And also just kind of like the nature, like wildlife and how that all connects. I haven't really been in touch with all this kind of very web-like way of thinking. I kind of want to get back into that because I think that's so important to keep reminding yourself of, like living in webs of meaning, webs of connection, webs of kinship. It's definitely a great way to explore like an academic discipline in a lot more of a interesting way and a lot more of an engaging way, so that's fun. Finally, the song I want to recommend is called Energy by Sampa the Great. I first came across this song through a Korean dance show called Street Woman Fighter, but recently it was recommended again to me through a shuffle random playlist, and it's such a great song. It talks about this female energy, and I don't think female energy is just about like having a female body per se, but it's really about embracing the kind of feminine energy and power that I think resides in everyone. And this song was such a testament and celebration of that. And the beats are great. The lyrics are great. So that's the end of my video. That's the end of my wrap up. I hope it was fun for you this time round. I did finish a lot more books than in January, so there were a lot of things I could talk about in this wrap up. And I hope that you're taking good care of yourself. Please rest well, and I hope that you have a peaceful and restful night tonight, and that tomorrow will be a brighter and better day for you. Thank you so much for spending your day with me, and I hope you're staying safe, hope you're staying well, and thank you so much for spending your time on this little channel. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. I know I've been uploading a lot in February. That was like a personal challenge for me, but I think I'm gonna stick back to the once a week upload from now on, and we'll see what that turns out to be. So thank you and bye.